So today we have Fabrice Desmarescaux, and here is why he is awesome, besides the fact he's giving me the evil eye if I mispronounce his name wrong again. I'm trying, man. He is a partner and practice leader at McKinsey and Company, and through them, and a Birkin hub leader for Southeast Asia, which works to expand consciousness with leaders to be a force for good in our world. Wow, I've got some questions. He's also the author of The Art of Retreats, a leader's journey toward clarity, balance, and purpose. And today we're going to dig into old world wisdom that we leaders can take into the new world of work. This should be interesting. Hello, Fabrice.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon for you, I guess.
Yes, we're getting to be that way. Before we get into how we can look at the world a little differently by learning from what has happened before and different ways of thinking, I have to ask the question I ask all of my guests, Fabrice. Sorry, you're not off the hook. It is, what is your best or worst employee experience?
I'll tell you about my best employee experience. About 12 years ago, I started a consulting firm with two partners, and we grew it nicely to serve clients in the region. That, for me, was the best experience. Now, I'm not sure I was an employee because I was a founder of a company and a partner, but going to work, knowing that you're in a safe environment, that your partners, your colleagues have the same motivation that you have to do well for the clients, to do well for each other, and knowing that, I could make mistakes, I could be myself. That was by far the best experience I've had. And we ran this company successfully. We eventually sold it. And when I retired, I sold my remaining shares to my partners. But that was a fantastic experience. And we all had the same corporate experience. We all had worked in various professional services firms, some excellent, some less good, but we all wanted to have this small family feeling of really trying to do well by each other, which was a very big difference compared to what I see around me in the corporate world sometimes.
And I'm hoping that this was intentional and not just a happy accident. I mean, you're building the environment as a founder of this organization that's going out and doing a thing. You're setting the tone. What did you do to create an environment that was like that for you?
You're absolutely right. So it was by design and not by accident. Obviously, reality was slightly different than what we had imagined. The companies have a life of their own and cultures have a life of their own that you cannot predict. But we started by doing two things. Number one is we wanted people to be able to grow on the job. And so we had a continuum of roles and experiences for the people we would hire. We would hire typically young people in their mid-20s to early 30s. And over time, we would apprentice them so that they could grow and potentially become senior employees and potentially partners of the firm. So that was one view, as opposed to say, well, we pigeonhole you in this role, and then when we need to hire someone more senior, we hire from the outside. So we had to do it occasionally, but mostly we were trying to do apprenticeship and developing people. So that's one. And that's a technique that I had learned in the old days during my first stint at McKinsey. McKinsey is very much about promoting people from within and developing leaders from within. The second thing is that we put a lot of emphasis on working together, which is not a given in a lot of professional services firms, because at the end of the day, people are their own bosses and producers. And so they have to take care of themselves before they take care of others. And we turn this system upside down and we say, you cannot be successful in this firm unless you work in teams and you take care of others. And there was a perfect client justification for that. Clients prefer to be served by a team than by a single individual. There's more diversity, better ideas, more continuity if someone is on holidays or sick or leaves the firm, etc. And so we created a team environment, and that made a whole difference, because suddenly you're no longer as good as your last month or your last quarter, and you're on your own and you have to fight. And as we know, sometimes business is good and sometimes it's not good, and you take the whole weight of those variations, whereas in a team environment, the burden and the joys are shared. and therefore much more pleasant to navigate and much more constructive.
One more question to wrap up. I'm super curious because you're building a culture, you're building an environment that people want to be in and nurture. But to your earlier point, you were hiring younger. I'm assuming you're trying to hire younger, the people that don't have too much baggage, that have, are still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, as opposed to those that might be a little more jaded or set in their ways. How are you looking at them to go, you're going to fit within our culture, or at least we can help you grow within our culture, as opposed to, you know what, you're just not going to be a right fit? Like what was it that you were looking for?
Well, actually, we spent more time when we were recruiting. We would normally spend a lot more time telling our story and what we do and how we do things, because people self-select. And I think it's very important in the recruitment process to be as transparent as you can to say, look, this is our firm, this is what we do. And I would not be shy to say, look, this is what we're good at and this is where we suck.
Right.
And let people self-select. Now, of course, occasionally there's people that you don't want to hire, and that we would do that through extensive referencing. So we would speak to former employers, former colleagues, etc. We would be very thorough in taking references. I'm not a big fan of the interviewing process. I think it's a necessary step in any recruitment to meet the candidates face to face and interview them, of course. Right. But that is maybe 20% of the information. There's so many biases that emerge when we interview people. I like this person, therefore she must be good. Well, the fact that I like her and the fact that she's good are completely uncorrelated events. And the recruitment mistakes I've made and my partners have made, and we made a few recruitment mistakes, were all based on, I like this person, but we didn't check enough whether this person had good references and therefore would either be a competent professional or would fit well in our type of culture.
I love that you highlighted that. I mean, I know I've met people, I'm like, you're an amazing person. I would never want you to lead a team in your life. Like, you are great to hang out with and shoot ideas around, but you hate conflict, or you're like so many other reasons that you shouldn't be integrated into a team, just purely on my ability of wanting to hang out with you or my interest in hanging out with you. Thank you for highlighting that. I really like that, because people will think, because I like you, you must be a good fit. And those do not equate to each other.
Yeah. Now, I would not turn that into the opposite. Like, because I don't like you, I'm going to hire you.
True. Fair.
I'm not here to make my life miserable. So given the choice, I would rather work with people I like. But the I like you is not a very good criteria. So if I don't like the person, I would normally pass. But if I like the person, then we would go into thoroughly checking the background, the references, the track record, explaining what we do and how we do it, and see if this person resonates and with our way of doing things.
Fair. Thank you for that. Let's get into what we're going to talk about today, because I'm super curious in looking at that old world wisdom as we defined it when I talked to you last time. I'm curious though, because one of the big things I've learned about this show is we have to define things, because too many people will throw out terms and then we'll keep talking and they're like, are we on the same page? Are we actually talking about the same thing? So before we get too far, Fabrice, what do you mean when we're talking about old world wisdom? What are you referencing? What are you referring to?
Well, let me take a step back. First, what do I do for a living? Because we said, okay, Fabrice leads, is part of the global leadership practice at McKinsey. That sounds all super good, but what is it that we do exactly, right? And so we work very closely with our clients and so owners, CEOs, senior executive teams, to help them reach higher levels of performance. Now, we do that through a number of activities, including one-on-one coaching, team coaching, retreats, teaching occasionally, etc. So I think it's important because we are helping our clients ultimately reach higher levels of performance. Where I'm saying traditional wisdom is important is that there's a trend that I see in the corporate world that has been going on for a while, where performance justifies everything. And so we lose our connection to purpose of being decent human beings of appreciating what the long term can bring us without trying to take shortcuts all the time. Right? And I see that pressure to deliver short-term results and therefore do anything that you can do. And losing perspective of what is good, what is beautiful, what is true, as the Greek philosophers would say. And that leads to all kinds of excesses. Now, without going into the worst cases of corporate greed, etc., that are well publicized, I think today, if you look at the quality of life in the corporations at large, and that could be for-profit corporations, even non-profit corporations, governments, state-owned companies, etc., it's gone down because the people at the top are under tremendous pressure to deliver short-term results. Now, that's particularly true for publicly listed corporations, where essentially the cycle is a quarterly cycle, right? But it's true everywhere. So to give you an example, I work with two large financial institutions, both publicly listed, both doing extremely well. So they are producing great results, but the share price, for reasons that we don't need to go into right now, the share price has been beaten down. And there's like a panic on board to say, oh my God, we need to cut costs, no more travel, no more this, no more that, because the market is not rewarding us for the good results we have. Now, I can understand that. If you're the CEO of one of these corporations and you continue delivering subpar share price, you're probably not going to keep your job very long. At the same time, we see now leaders deliberately destroying corporate cultures and putting what I would call unfair pressure on their employees. This sort of it's never good enough. You're only as good as your last quarter or your last month or your last year. Layoffs, not justified again by the companies losing money. No, the company is making a lot of money, but we resort to layoffs as a way to boost the P&L, etc. And so, where is this taking us? I don't know. But what I see is that we're on a very dangerous trajectory. And so I bring my clients back to, what has made us the great human beings that we can be. And for that, there's no better place to go than to look read the great philosophers and draw inspiration from the major spiritual traditions. And I often joke with my clients to say, look, anything you need to know about leadership has been written 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. And you find all the premises, and I will give you a couple of examples, but you find all the premises of being a decent human being, being a leader, and building a great company in stuff that has weathered the centuries. Mm-hmm. So, an example. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is the classic of Indian spiritual traditions, there's a line that says, you're entitled to your work, but not to the fruits of your labor. Now, the exact sentence varies depending on the translations, but yes, you can do the work, but do not do the work because you're expecting outcomes. Do the work because the work is good. So do what is good, do what is right. In a way, we would call it intrinsic motivation. Right. Do the work because it fulfills you. And this is not to say you shouldn't make money out of your work. Money will flow. Good things will flow. Happy clients will flow from that. But you shouldn't do your work because you're expecting monetary outcomes, or you're expecting market share or share prices. Right? Do the work because the work is good. And good outcomes will follow from that. And you find that in other spiritual traditions. You find exactly the same message in the Bible, for example. The act of selfless service. Do it because it's the right thing to do, and you're not doing it for yourself. And everyone who does that ends up doing very well for themselves. That's the funny thing. So do not lose the why you're doing something with expectation of outcomes. Now, this is 3,000 years old. This has not been created by, Harvard Business School or MIT or INSEAD. Does that make sense?
It does. And so, but I mean, to be honest, anybody that's listening to it going, okay, but what does that mean? Meaning they're like, okay, is Taoism where I should start? Is that going to help me improve my life and work? Or Confucianism? Or as I look at Stoicism? So it's a matter of, is it a matter of picking something and going down the rabbit hole to see if it works for you first? Or is it just doing a buffet and sort of trying to understand how these ancient philosophies work for you and your intent in the workplace?
Well, I think anyone listening will probably have some cultural background in one spiritual tradition or another. I mean, a lot of people define themselves as agnostic, and that's absolutely fine. But, everybody will have been immersed culturally in the teachings of one tradition or another, and sometimes several traditions. So all I'm saying is go back to the roots, go back to immersing yourself. And I'm not advocating, I'm not proselytizing here and say, adhere to an organized religion. I'm saying just go back to the roots, read your classics, and you will find a lot of inspiration about what leadership is. Let me give you another example. About 15 centuries ago, a Catholic monk, Benedict, decided to simplify life because there were even in year 500 there was like already too many distractions. They didn't have Netflix and mobile phones, but he was feeling the pressure of distractions, and he said, well, let's go back to simplified life. Let's create what was essentially one of the first monastic communities, and for that he created a very simple rule, 50 pages of how the community would be governed. Now, 15 centuries later, there's Benedictine communities all over the world following the exact principles that were spelled out 15 centuries ago. And they're thriving. So, what does that teach us? Well, it teaches us that you can think long-term. You can ask for yourself and for your company, for example, where do I want this company to be in 15 centuries? It's not a stupid question, right? Now, obviously, no one has the answer. No one knows. But am I putting down principles for my company that will withstand the test of time? And I find a lot of inspiration in these classics because these are rules, universal rules in a way of what it means to be a good human being and by extension, what it means to be a good leader.
What was the catalyst for you to go down this path? I mean, have you always been going, I'm going to set my blueprint based on 3,000-year-old teachings? Or was it a matter of eventually going, no, something's not working, or I need to overcome some sort of roadblock or challenge, and this is where you went for inspiration? What was your own story around this?
Well, my own story is that I was like a hard-nosed performance for the sake of performance guy, right, pretty much for the first half of my career. And so, no particular religious education, fairly agnostic, curious, but agnostic. And I thrived in that kind of environment. But then I started looking around, and through literally, I kid you not, Russell, thousands of conversations with senior executives in the course of my work, realized that something was really out of balance. The work for the sake of work, growth for the sake of growth, profit for the sake of profit was actually making people fairly miserable. Mm-hmm. Now, they would be happy with what they had achieved in life. They had a big house, a nice car, etc. But there was fundamentally something lacking from the lives of a lot of the senior executives I was working with. And I put that on the account that we have lost the connection with our spiritual roots. Now, it doesn't matter to me what spiritual tradition you're most interested in. And if you want to cherry pick from one and another, we can debate whether this is the fastest path or not, but I really don't care. But what I'm saying is, somehow our system puts so much pressure on individuals and teams at every level of the corporate pyramid that we've lost track of what it means to find purpose and what it means to find balance and behave as a decent human being. Now, the thousands of leaders I've worked with are actually decent human beings. So it's not to say, oh, the corporate is terrible, only psychopaths reach the top. I mean, yeah, I've also met a few psychopaths. But in general, most people are decent. But they're also a product of the environment in which they operate, which is why your topic about how do we create great environments, how do we build great relationships at work, how do we create great culture is so important. Because the difference between a culture that values human beings and a culture that just values the share price is enormous. So that's how it got me started, in the second half of my life and my career, really. I mean, I made the shift. Maybe I started, I guess I always had an interest in spiritual traditions. I was practicing meditation and yoga, and became a yoga teacher, meditation teacher when I was fairly young. But it's really in the course of my work with leaders, with senior leaders, that I said, okay, there's something that's missing out of the equation today. And my life today is about restoring this balance between performance, if you want, and purpose. And purpose without performance leads to bankruptcy, and that doesn't help anyone. But performance without purpose will lead to organizations that are, first of all, that make people miserable, but also that are very brittle and subject to a lot of volatility. So restoring this balance between, yes, we need performance. So we need to constantly think, what does the market want? What is the right pricing? What is the target operating model that we should follow? What is the right level of cost for the revenue we're generating, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, there's question of purpose. Why are we doing this? And who would miss us if we didn't exist?
Right.
When I go home and I tell my kids what I do, is there something that I can be proud of? That I can explain in very simple words that an 8-year-old would understand? Why is it important, what I'm doing? And once you combine the two, I guarantee that outcomes are always very good. Whereas just focusing on performance leads to tremendous pressure and a lot of knee-jerk, short-term reactions. Oh, we didn't have a good month, so let's start cutting people, etc., which we see all around us, which is really not a recipe for stability and for thriving organizations.
I'm glad you brought up meditation and yoga. The reason I ask this is it's one thing to read these ancient philosophies, but I almost feel like you have to operationalize it a bit. And a lot of this is self-reflection. Like when I think of any traditional wisdom, I'm going back into these things like meditation, silence, reflection, solitude. Like these seem to be hand in hand with any of these philosophies we're talking about, because it's a lot of inner work before we can start practicing and implementing them in our work as well. Do you think that's the path to really start getting people more comfortable with this way of thinking and looking to these older reflections by putting these things into practice that help with that, like journaling and so forth, that sort of, I don't know, it sort of feeds the beast, I guess, for a lack of a better phrase, to get you more comfortable with this way of thinking?
100%. I mean, you're absolutely spot on, Russell. I think if you want to think about the sort of a sequence, it's not a hierarchy, but it's a sequence. You have to lead yourself before you can lead teams and before you can lead large organizations. The lead yourself part starts with self-awareness, which, by the way, in modern management literature is, was popularized by Daniel Goleman, emotional intelligence, right? So there's a vocabulary in the modern leadership literature, but it comes from the spiritual traditions, particularly Eastern spiritual traditions. Mostly, meditation is essentially a tool of self-awareness. So what I tell my clients is, don't go on a silence meditation retreat where for 10 days at the beginning starts with 5 minutes at home.
Right.
But start noticing what is happening. And one key, I know you want practical tools, is when you think about how you're going to interact with others, for example. Are you coming at that situation from a place of love, or are you coming at that situation from a place of fear? That is a very, very practical tool, right? I need to have this meeting with my boss. I need to have this meeting with this underperforming employee. I'm going to meet a client and they're not particularly happy with us. Okay. Am I going at this from a place of love, or am I going at this from a place of fear? Now, this is a self-awareness exercise. If you don't spend time in silence and solitude regularly, you're not going to be able to notice these signals. Finding what fulfills you. Let's not call it grand purpose, because I think people say, I'm going to save the world and whatever. But what fulfills you? What is a job that fulfills you? That takes a lot of self-awareness. Most of us fall into a career by accident. We just follow the road that is available in front of us. Sometimes we're pushed by our parents. Sometimes we follow friends, whatever. But, a lot of us fall into a career by accident. But at some point, you build that self-awareness. Is this career, is this job, is this profession something that fulfills me? That requires self-awareness. So I always say, start with leading the self. Self-awareness, managing your emotions, not pushing them under the carpet, but recognizing your emotions, and then also noticing that emotions are very fleeting. That comes straight from the Buddhist tradition. Not noticing the impermanence in all things, including in my feelings, my emotions, my physical sensations. Right? So practice that, and there's very, very simple tools and plenty of resources available now for everywhere. And then move to the next practice, which is, how do I create a team? Right? How do I interact with others in a way that is truthful, that is mindful? So, for example, another practical tool, when you meet someone, standard, how are you? Well, do you care about the response or not? So my encouragement to anyone who listens is, next time you meet someone, you go to a meeting and you're going to have an interaction with someone, ask, how are you? And take an interest in the response. And maybe ask again, how are you truly, if it's someone that you know sufficiently well? Because most people won't tell you exactly how they are. They'll say, I'm very busy. Well, okay, no, busy is not how you are. So spending time to have meaningful interactions with others, slowing down the clock so that you can truly connect with another human being. And yes, I know meetings are half an hour on Zoom, 1 hour face-to-face. It goes very, very fast. But take a few minutes. Take a few minutes at the beginning. It changes the tone of the meetings. Right? So learn to build these interactions. And again, there's tons that come from the spiritual traditions about how to create meaningful interactions with others. And lastly, you move to leading large organizations and leading change at scale, right? So I think it all starts with the self. And that's why I wrote that book for leaders, because there was so much disconnection. We're so much in a hurry to do everything, and then we're distracted by our phones constantly. So, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, before the smartphones, you would be much more connected to the present moment, right? You're in a queue, you wait. You're in the subway, right? You look at the other passengers, you see what's happening around you, maybe you bring a book, right? Today, the slightest moment, 10 seconds of queuing time, I'm going to get my phone. So we've lost contact with ourselves and with our surroundings. So I'm just encouraging people, and my book, The Art of Retreat, is about how to take a little bit of time, in silence and solitude to reconnect with yourself so that you can connect better with others. It's all very simple. Now, I haven't invented anything. Everything I write about in the book is, as I said, 2,000 or 3,000 years old for the most part. I mean, there's a little bit of modern psychology, Carl Jung and the rest. But
I'm glad you started with self-awareness, because a big part of this show is we talk about relationships at work, but the most important relationship is the one you have with yourself. Because truthfully, no other connections or relationships will matter or have as much connection or value than if you don't get yourself figured out. Now, here's something I do struggle with, though, and it brought it up for me because you were like, you're looking for tactical things. I'm like, I'm not really, because truthfully, my way of looking at it is, if you don't shift your mindset, you're not going to do those things anyway. If you don't provide yourself the new perspectives, new worldviews on even approaching ancient wisdoms, traditional wisdoms, even looking at this as a value statement, if you don't look at it like this, you're never going to try anything. And this is where my challenge is. But if you don't try these things, like the things you've illustrated, you may not be inspired to go further with it. So I feel like you need to shift your mindset, but you need to shift your mindset and not focus on tactics, but you need to focus on tactics sometimes to shift your mindset to see that it has value and that it'll work. So how would you approach this if somebody's trying to go down this path and try to really make it, operationalize it, but at the same time, they're trying to shift their way they think?
Yeah. So if there's not a need, if you don't feel a need, that something is not in balance, that maybe you're not following the best road for you, you're not on the right journey. If you don't feel that need, and everything is working well, then I say it's very difficult to decide to change. But what I always say is that, if everything is going well in your life and there's absolutely no reason for introspection, just wait 5 minutes, right? Because at some point, life is going to come back and throw something at you. There is no one on this planet that hasn't been challenged by life. Now, some people have been challenged more than others, but looking at Instagram and seeing all these apparently happy people with their beautiful families, and they're always on the beach somewhere in the Caribbean drinking a Coke. This is not real life. Real life is messy, and real life throws a lot of challenges at you. And it's in these moments of challenge, maybe when everything goes well, you don't feel the need to do the deeper reflection and deeper introspection. But it's in the moments of challenge, which, by the way, are the moments where we have the biggest opportunity to grow, that we feel the need maybe to reflect and deepen our self-awareness and deeper our connection with ourselves. So I usually work with individuals who feel that challenge. Could be a crisis at work, could be someone who's been promoted into a big job, and I do a lot of coaching new CEOs who are in the role for the first time, and we think, oh my God, they must be so happy they finally got the top job. But it's very difficult. And there's no one to talk to, because suddenly you're alone. The CEO is a very lonely job. So at these junctures, critical junctures, people who have been very successful, have made a lot of money, and they're looking at retirement, but retirement creates a big void. So it's in these junctures that people are the most open to the inner journey. And that's usually where I come in.
Is it an easy conversation? And I bring this up because I have a bit of a challenge with a lot of executives, because they've been rewarded their entire career with not having to be good leaders. Right? They get rewarded for productivity. They get rewarded for fixing results. They get rewarded for the ends justify the means. So they are executive CEOs, never having to be good to people, because they gave shareholder value. They made the board happy. And now they're at the top going, I have to learn this now. I'm too busy. 7 books to read. Sorry, I don't have the time. But you're saying that this is where they're most interested in addressing this problem, when I'm also looking at it going, hasn't that ship kind of sailed? Shouldn't we be focusing more on middle management and those people that are wanting to do better to get to that result?
I think we should do both.
Right.
I think we should do both. I tend to focus more on the CEOs because, in a way, there's not a lot of people who can work with them. They're also very selective, and so there's very few coaches who can empathize with what it's like to be a CEO. So I tend to focus on the top of the pyramid, but I don't think we should neglect anyone. The thing for me is that it starts at the top. If I can change one leader, if I can change one CEO into becoming slightly more aware and therefore restoring a little bit this balance between action and contemplation, or between performance and purpose. If I just make a 10% difference, then it cascades down the rest of the pyramid. I will typically work with the CEO, and then I will work with that team. And that's where I can have the most impact.
So what's the tipping point when you get to go back to my question? What is the tipping point for you to go to a CEO going, you're not going to believe this. We're going to talk about Stoicism. No, wait a second. We're going to talk about Confucianism. What is it where they're like, well, this isn't the latest and greatest innovative thought processing? What makes them more receptive? Is there a certain way of talking or introducing case studies that helps them along that journey?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit more sneaky than that. I don't lead with the Upanishad or the Bible, right? Because that has a way of scaring people away.
Exactly.
So I lead with business. And so my first session with any executive usually is about how's business? What's going on in your life? What's happening? How can I support you? Right? And we get a broad conversation about everything that's happening in their life, right? Occasionally we talk about family. I say, well, where do you go to when you need help? Because now you're very lonely, right? You cannot go to your chairman because in a way the chairman is evaluating you. You cannot go to your former peers who now report to you. So where do you go? Who are your mentors? Who are your trusted advisors, etc.? So we do a pretty extensive 360. I ask them about the personal practices that they have. How do you stay sane? Do you exercise? How do you sleep?
Right.
What do you eat? Do you have any practices? Do you practice meditation, journaling? Right? Usually the answer is no, but you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. Maybe, I don't have statistics, but maybe 20, 25% of people practice meditation. And so, if there's no opening, I don't force anything. I'm not a spiritual leader. I don't do any proselytism. I'm happy to talk business, balance sheet, P&L all day long if you want. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think it's the best leverage because all these things are external. And I think the real change happens when we start looking inward, not when we look outward, right? So changing the outside world is all fine. But where you get the most bang for the buck is when you start looking inward. And most people open up, sometimes in the first session, sometimes in session number 6. Sometimes they fire me after the first session because they think I'm useless. It's a chemistry thing, right? So I don't have 100% hit rates. And I can do an entire coaching journey with a CEO and their team without ever mentioning any of the topics we discussed just now. And that's perfectly fine.
Is that where retreats can become handy? Because you're removing them from the familiar. You're removing them from the crutches or the community they can rely on to give them their self-fulfilling prophecies. So putting them in maybe another environment, is that the reason for it?
Yeah, no, that you're spot on. So when a CEO says, "Hey, Fabrice, can you come and spend? Can we spend 2 days together with my team? I'd like to get some alignment. We need to look at the plan for 2025. I say, okay, but can we not do it in your office? Can we not do it in your boardroom? Can we go somewhere?" And there's many reasons for that. Reason number 1 is the boardroom or whatever, the meeting room next to the CEO office is so filled with bad vibes and bad energy of, endless budget meetings and you can feel that negative energy dripping from the walls. And so I said, let's go. Plus, people are in their power status. It's a glass building in the center of town. The secretaries walk all the time in to ask them to sign papers. So it's really not conducive to deeper reflection. Let's go out. But more importantly, when we go out, I get the chance to configure the room the way I want it. So I remove all the tables, for example. There's no more tables. We sit in a circle. The reason I do that is if you put a table in front of people, the first thing they do is they put their phones and their laptop, and then they're distracted, and you don't have 100% of their presence. So remove the table. There's nowhere to put the laptop. And I kid you not, I've had entire day sessions with very, very senior executives where no one looks at their phone. I mean, they will look at their phone during the breaks. But during the session, when we're in session, there's absolutely zero distraction. People are 100% present on their colleagues and on themselves because we remove the distractions. And the third reason why I go off on retreats is because very often we go to a nice place with nature, and the fact that you have trees and water and mountains or whatever around you completely changes the energy. And it reconnects the participants fundamentally to what it is to be human, right? Which is to be connected with nature. So yes, for all that, I think a retreat environment. Now, I don't call it retreat very often. I call it offsite. I don't like the term workshop, but offsite is good, because if I call it retreat, then they immediately think, we're going to have to shave our heads and go into a monastery. So but it is a retreat. The etymology of the word is, we retreat from the daily environment, so to be in a place where we can be more present. Right. So that works very well, and I always encourage my clients, take your team and go on a retreat with your team, and you can talk about anything. You can talk about the plan, you can talk about the strategy, you can talk about the clients, you can talk about purpose, you can talk about how do we interact with each other? Are we telling each other the truth? Are we holding each other accountable? Right. So there's so many topics you can bring in a retreat.
As we're getting closer to the end of the conversation there, I kind of want to, I don't know if this sounds the right way of putting it, take you for a test drive for a minute. I want to ask the question around, say a leader is going down this path, understanding how traditional wisdom can be useful, but they want to understand something better. And they're looking for what philosophies might help with that. I'm thinking of clarity. I'm thinking, because definitions are huge, and I mentioned this off the top, because clarity is not something that's really great in organizations. We use words, we do completely opposite things. We have values on the wall, we don't do any of those things. So we're never really clear about what we're talking about. But if there's a leader going, you know what, I want to strengthen my ability to be clear, to communicate better, to connect better, what would you say? Is there a line of philosophy that you would go, you know what, deism is actually the philosophy that works best for what you're trying to achieve? Is it as simple as that? Or is it a matter of, you know what, this area, Eastern versus Western philosophies might be more your jam? What would you direct some leader that's looking to fix or enhance that ability?
So I tell you what I do is usually I follow the traditions or the culture in which my client has been raised.
Oh, okay.
And I go deeper in that tradition, right? So if my client is a Christian, for example, then I will ask them, where do they find inspiration in the Bible, for example, or do they have a community? Do they go to a specific church? And I find anchor points to say, well, maybe you can find moments of friendship and companionship in that community. And ask yourself, for example, what is different in that community, in that spiritual community, from the way you and your teams work in the office, right? If I work with a Muslim client, typically they will stop for prayer 5 times a day, right? But these prayers are fantastic times for self-awareness, because imagine stopping for 10 minutes 5 times a day. What a wonderful opportunity to reset your nervous system. So I say, well, look, instead of skipping the prayer, because a lot of them, in big jobs, they skip the prayers, right? I say, no, go for it. Particularly the Friday prayer is important. In Asia, a lot of people have been brought up in Taoism or Buddhism or some combination of both. There's a bit of syncretism that happens everywhere. So say, okay, what? Go find your inspiration where you come from. And now in the West, a lot of people are agnostic. And so they don't feel particularly tethered to any spiritual tradition. And they say, well, why don't we start with simple mindfulness? Non-denominational, paying attention to what is. And we start with mindfulness. I recommend them, some resources, some apps, some whatever. And say, let's start with that. And then maybe, do 5 minutes of mindfulness and then maybe a bit of journaling. What is going on for you? What are you grateful for? I don't need to name any spiritual traditions, but gratitude is part of every tradition. You find gratitude in Buddhism, in Christianity, in Islam, and Judaism, everywhere. So, I don't need to name it. I connect people to what is most accessible to them.
And less conflict, lean into their comfort levels. I can see the adoption being a lot easier when it comes to that. Where my brain is the diversity side of things. So if there's a leader that's going, well, I want to lean into my Christianity, and then their team at work's agnostic, and they're like, you know what? I don't want to buy into what you're selling because it works for you, but it doesn't work for us. Is there any pushback when it comes to introducing old world wisdom when it's tied to religion that people might not be comfortable with outside of the particular individual?
Well, I think religion is a very personal thing. And so I would not recommend bringing your religion into the office unless you know that this is, this widespread acceptance of it. So I think it's a personal topic. But I think the principles of any religious tradition or any spiritual tradition are universal.
Right.
And so I always work on where does your tradition come from on this topic? What learnings, what teachings? If you go into, a period of reflection, maybe on the weekend, take 1 hour, bring your traditional texts with you, do a bit of reflection, a bit of journaling. Where does that guide you to go? And then you bring the results of that to your teams, but you don't say, oh, the other day I was reading, the Analects of Confucius, and it tells us to do this and this and that. Or, no, you don't need to impose anything on anyone. I think a gentle approach of leveraging whatever resources you have and then bring that following universal human principles of kindness, generosity, gratitude, attention to each other, presence, etc. is the way to go.
It's just hard when divisiveness is such a default for so many people. I completely hear you and going, don't bring it up. Even if it's personal to you, do not bring it up in the workplace because that's not what this is for. It's about bringing people together. It's just, I hate when people use any excuse to go, no, that's not me. It's you, ones and zeros. It's binary when it shouldn't be. It should be about community and it should be about what connects us, not divides us. So I appreciate you clarifying it in that way.
Yeah, and these principles are universal. I think anyone will resonate with the principle of community. Anyone will resonate with the principle of generosity. It doesn't matter where you come from. And we don't need to mention any religion, any spiritual tradition for that.
Nope, I love that. So Fabrice, I got to wrap this up with our last question, sir, which is what's one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
Well, I'll say again what I mentioned briefly earlier. When you're going to have an interaction with someone, ask yourself before the meeting, am I going at this from a place of love or am I going at this from a place of fear? And there's no judgment.
Nope.
If you're going at it from a place of fear, all I want you to do is acknowledge it and be aware of it. It's okay to be afraid. But once you acknowledge it, it diminishes the fear anyway.
That is Fabrice Desmarescaux. He's a partner and practice leader at McKinsey & Company, and he's the author of The Art of Retreats, A Leader's Journey Toward Clarity, Balance, and Purpose. Thank you so much for being here, Fabrice. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Russell. I really enjoyed it.